So yeah, we're here to discuss the Greater Israel Project and corruption at home. So we have two virtual guests. Trita Parsi is, there's a time difference, so he has to leave us, unfortunately, at 7 p.m. So I'll probably put a lot of the questions to him, just to let you guys know. We have with us Trita Parsi. Is he going to pop up on the screen any second? So Trita Parsi is, well, everyone here, all the panelists are authors, and they're all sorts of geopolitical experts. Trita Parsi also advised on the 2015 nuclear deal. And we have Professor Marandi. So he should be popping up in a second. Professor Marandi is actually an advisor on the current nuclear negotiations and is also author and analyst. And we have Lale Khalili. So she lives in London with us. Author, analyst, and Carne Ross as well, who's a former diplomat. He resigned over Iraq, very importantly. And you have a diplomatic advisory group. Okay. But still a regular person on Al Jazeera. He had a great interview just the other day. So before we start, I just want to say a couple of things, well, a little thing, a paragraph or two, about why I organised this event. So as we witness the darkest extremes of human cruelty decimating innocence, it's our duty to do everything within our power and potential to transform our ways. Key to this transformation is the urgent need to face ourselves, face our fear, our comfort, our biases, our resistance to change. Face the powers that we're afraid to fight, face the powers that manipulate our primal instincts, powers devoid of strength but full of deception. Deception that separates Palestinian agony from our agency. Deception that encourages us to judge their struggle rather than hear their cries. Deception that vilifies the region, stokes racial hatred, apathy, war, economic and climate collapse. As we reach the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we can reflect at this juncture with Iran. We can reflect with open hearts and minds and acknowledge the great game that we have subjected Iran to, as well as the wider region and the global south. We can break the modus operandi and demand that we find another way together in our shared humanity. So my first question is to Trita, because like I said, Trita's got to leave a bit earlier, so I'm going to focus on Trita for a bit. So what scope is there for a new strategic alliance that can break the modus operandi? Can you tell us a little bit about the Middle East and the agreement where they want no weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East? So Zarif is part of that, and I've forgotten the term. But if you could just tell us more about new strategic alliances.
Thank you. It's great being with you. And sorry that I do have to leave early. I'm not terribly familiar with the new proposal. I think former Foreign Ministers Javad Zarif had an op-ed in The Guardian about this. But I can tell you that the idea of these things have circulated on numerous occasions in the region. In fact, already back in 1973, the Shah of Iran and Egypt at the time formed this effort for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, have championed that cause. And it wasn't a surprise that the two most populous countries in the region at the time did so, because they're the ones that have the most to lose from nuclearization of the region, because both of them had a conventional military superiority that they would lose if the region actually went nuclear. But I think it's important to understand that in this context, even if such an agreement were to be found, it still fails to address a core driver of instability in the region. And that is that the Israeli state, the manner in which it defines its own security, is such that it needs to dominate the region in order for itself to feel secure. The normal way of defining a threat for most states, for most militaries, is to say that threat equals capacity, capability times intent. In the Israeli definition, however, intent is assumed to always be constant, always being there. So they focus only on capability, which then means that Israel needs to pursue a strategy of military hegemony, always being in a position to outgun everyone or every combination of states in the region in order for itself to feel safe. This is part of the reason why in the United States, as a result of pressure from Israel, adopted as a law that the US has to uphold Israel's what it calls qualitative strategic military edge, meaning that at all times Israel needs to be superior to all of its neighbors or any combination of its neighbors. As long as that is the case, I think we're going to see conflict and tensions in the region. We can see that in the case of Syria has a new government, one that I'm personally quite skeptical of, mindful of its ISIS and Al-Qaeda past. But as soon as the Assad regime fell, the Israelis immediately began bombing everywhere in Syria, ensuring that the next Syria, whoever would be governing it, would have no capacity, forget about intent, no capacity to be able to pose any challenge to Israel. And I think that was also the plan with Iran. It doesn't matter if there's a regime change in Iran or not. In fact, one Israeli general told me at one point that because Iran at one point had been a friend of Israel during the time of the Shah and then turned into an enemy, even if it turns into a friend again in the future, it can once again turn into an enemy. And as a result, Israel's focus will not be on the regime, but on the capacity and capability. Now, for a state of 6 million people to essentially keep 300 plus million people under its military hegemony is simply not tenable, nor will any of the major states accept that. And as a result, you will see a continuation of tensions in the region until all states actually have a similar, manageable, and compatible military doctrine, one that at this point the Israelis are completely outside of. So even if we do manage to get some sort of a nuclear agreement, whether it is a broader one or if it's just one in the case of Iran, I do not believe that that will spell the end of much of the tensions that we're seeing right now, unfortunately.
So what do you think can be done to stop Israel being so superior? Is there, how can we disempower Israel?
Well, first of all, I think the Israelis have to recognize themselves that what they're pursuing is unattainable. It is one thing for a state to seek hegemony based on its own power. That is not what the Israelis are doing. The Israelis are pursuing hegemony based on another power's capacity, and that is of the United States. This was not an Israeli-Iranian war. This was a war in which the US was fully engaged, perhaps not as much on the offensive side, but had it not been for the significant level of support that the United States provided Israel in terms of its air defense systems, etc., Israel would not have been able to start this war in the first place. In fact, I think it is because of the impact of the Iranian missiles that the Israelis ultimately agreed to a ceasefire. Had the United States agreed to continue to be a full partner in the war instead of what essentially was a one-off by Trump in terms of his attack on the nuclear facilities, I'm sure the Israelis would have thought that the cost-benefit analysis is still positive because of the massive power the US would bring to the table. But once it became clear that the US was only going to do that against the nuclear facilities and then wanted an end to the war, it didn't make any sense for the Israelis to continue the war, mindful of the significant hits they were taking themselves, particularly towards the end of the war. So I think ultimately the Israelis themselves have to come to the realization this is, even if it was based on their own power, this is not a tenable strategy. But now when it's actually based on the power of another country whose population in droves are now turning against Israel, I think this is just a complete losing proposition for Israel itself.
So you feel that Israel's needs to prove itself to America on some level? Like it's lost its value to America, possibly?
I think the Israelis, by and large, lost their value strategically to the United States already with the end of the Cold War. Back during the Cold War, the Israeli foundation for its relationship with the United States was that it was an outpost of a Western ally holding up against Soviet penetration into the region. It was motivated, justified on strategic grounds. After the end of the Cold War, the Israelis struggled to be able to sustain a strategic justification for the relationship. And that's when you start hearing a completely new argument, which was that the Israeli-American alliance is based on shared values. That terminology enters into the dictionary at that time, precisely because it was increasingly difficult to justify it on strategic values. Today, I think it's really difficult to say that Israel is anything but a major strategic detriment to the United States, mindful of what it is doing in Gaza and the West Bank and the many other wars that it has started or is engaged in. It is consuming American power rather than adding to it. So I think the strategic argument, frankly, was lost quite some time ago.
Okay, that's quite positive. So it's more of a sort of PR argument. It's a brainwashing on some level. It's ideological alignment. Would you say it's more about that since the Cold War?
I think there is one element that is still working in favor of the Israelis, which is that those within, I would say, by and large, the blob and the deep state of the United States that seeks to continue to uphold some semblance of American hegemony in the Middle East. And I say that in the blob because outside of the blob, and increasingly the population does not want to pursue global hegemony, and certainly not in the Middle East. It's not been a particularly fruitful endeavor. But those within the blob and those within the American deep state that want to do so do, of course, find an ally in Israel because the Israelis are desperate to keep the United States militarily engaged in the region. This was also the case with the Saudis and some of the other states in the region whose own security is dramatically enhanced with the US providing some form of an umbrella to them. Whether that ultimately is good for the region, whether that ultimately is sustainable is a completely different story. But there is a coinciding of interest between those elements. And from their perspective, the Israelis are still of significant use.
So do you think the blob has more say on this or the American population? I mean, I'm not 100% convinced that we have the full American population on side. But yeah, what do you think is the biggest pressure?
Sorry, I have a really hard time hearing you. Could you repeat the question?
So you mentioned that there's the pressure of the blob holding that relationship together. But earlier you said you feel that the American population isn't on side with Israel. So where's the bigger pressure coming from?
Well, I mean, at this point, the pressure that is coming from the population is not being channeled in the manner that is needed in order for it to have the type of political impact. It is also coming primarily from younger people, the next generation, whose political power is not what it will be likely in 10 years. I do believe, however, that the demographic changes taking place in the United States are more or less irreversible in terms of their perspective on Israel. I think for a lot of the young people in the United States, their formative experience with Israel, and to a large extent, even international relations, has been essentially Israel engaging not only in apartheid at home, but also in a genocide. And on top of that, increasingly seen as a threat to freedom of speech in the United States. When you take a look at the young people who were protesting at the campuses of MIT, Columbia, Harvard, and many other universities in the United States, you have to keep in mind, these are not some community colleges. These are the institutions that are educating the future elite of this country. At least one of those students is going to run for president in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Many of them are going to serve in the Senate or on Capitol Hill. So I think you're seeing a significant shift whose fruition we will probably not see for another 5 to 15 years from now. But I do suspect that it is coming because this shift is not left-right, it is demographic. It's a different generation that has a completely different perspective on this issue, shaped very much by the events of the last couple of years.
Well, hopefully we can harness that, but I don't know if we've got 5 to 15 years in terms of like the Gaza population and the Greater Israel Project. You know, we have to kind of work more quickly, I think. So, Marandi, Professor Marandi, are you there? Hi, did you hear everything Trita had to say? Do you want to comment on what Trita had to say? I have a specific question for you, but firstly, do you want to comment on that?
No, I think everything that he said is accurate. I think that there has been dramatic change in the United States, but as he rightly pointed out, it is the youth that has changed most radically. And those above the age of 50, 55, 60, they have very differing views. And the predominant views that existed in the United States 2 years ago, 3 years ago, are still the same views, more or less, by that generation. It may have changed somewhat, but the real change has been brought about among the youth. And that is, of course, very welcome news. But at the same time, as you pointed out at the end, for the people of Gaza, that with the urgency that we see today with regards to the genocide, that is not a solution for them at the moment.
So how can we fasten the process?
No, I don't think that it's too late. I think that political change in the United States is going to be slow, but still there is a huge shift in public opinion in the United States and across the world. In Japan, we saw a huge protest, something which is not regularly seen in that country. Australia, under very bad weather, and we saw huge crowds going to the streets. The global mood has shifted, and it's shifting very rapidly, I think, over the past few weeks, although I don't have any scientific evidence for this, but it seems from the anecdotal evidence that's available that ever since the images of hungry or starving children and some adults have been seen on social media by many people, and since some people have been, we've had whistleblowers explaining what's happening on the ground, there has been a more rapid shift. And of course, we know that in the United States, influential people such as Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, among others, their views have become very hostile or critical of the Israeli regime. In the case of Candace Owens, quite antagonistic. These are changes that are happening, and I think each day that we move forward, the shift continues. But you are correct that we have to find short-term solutions right now in order to put pressure on governments to end the starvation siege, but also to end the attacks on civilians.
Well, and also end any sort of narrative about hostility towards Iran. I think it's quite incredible that whilst this is going on, I still read in the media a lot of stuff that paints Iran as a massive threat, where it's clear to me that the threat is Zionism and Zionism only. But obviously, I think there's still people here that buy into that idea of Iran being a threat to our security in the UK. What would you say to those people, Professor?
Well, the same people who for the past 4.5 decades, perhaps a little bit more, the same people who've been antagonizing Iran are the people who've been denying any wrongdoing by the Israeli regime in Gaza, in the West Bank, and across Palestine over the past few decades. And I think that is something that people should keep in mind. It is not Iran that occupied Palestinian territory. It's not Iran that has launched any wars over the past 250 years, let alone after the revolution. In fact, after the revolution in Iran, we had one war, now two wars waged on Iran. One lasted almost 8 years. That was initiated by Saddam Hussein and with Western support. And in that war, chemical weapons were used against Iran and Iranians, and those chemical weapons were given to Saddam Hussein by European governments, governments that allowed European companies to set up chemical weapons factories in Iraq. And the most important government that participated in the building up of Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons was, ironically, Germany.
Yeah.
And of course, the recent war which the Israeli regime launched against Iran was also carried out at a time when the Iranians were negotiating with the United States, and the war was unprovoked, and it killed hundreds of ordinary Iranians. Apartment blocks were brought down. So we have graveyards across the country in Iran with more than 200,000 people who've been killed in these wars, especially the war where Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And the West was a part of that, but we do not have any history of Iran attacking any European country, any neighboring country, and the UK in particular.
I mean, in my mind, I see it as Iran's had to play a very sort of defensive strategy, and the West has been very good at demonizing Iran and putting Islam under one umbrella. So can you break that propaganda down a little bit and talk a little bit about the sort of US-Wahhabi-Zionist approach to the Middle East that's been prevalent in modern Middle Eastern history?
Well, one of the extraordinary events that has taken place in our part of the world, meaning West Asia, is that the United States in the late 1970s, under President Jimmy Carter and his national security advisor, Brzezinski, the two hatched a plan where they would fund extremists, or the Mujahideen as they called them, in Afghanistan in order to encourage the Soviet Union to invade that country. And that happened. After because they wanted to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. After the Soviets invaded, the United States, the British, and Saudi Arabia in particular, but also the Emirates, they began to fund an ideology which was not very widespread at that time. It was Wahhabism. And Wahhabism and Salafism were something that were more local to Saudi Arabia. But that ideology was takfiri, and it was hostile towards anyone who thought differently from them. And they began to promote this ideology in the madrasas, in the schools, alongside the Afghan-Pakistani border, in order to create hostility towards Soviet soldiers. And interestingly, just as when I said earlier that the chemical weapons that were given to Saddam Hussein came from Europe, interestingly, the first school books that were takfiri and full of hatred and extremism were not published by Saudi Arabia. They were published in the United States at the University of Nebraska, Omaha publishers. So the University of Nebraska, Omaha had a hand in spreading extremism in Afghanistan. And of course, this extremism spread. And then, of course, we had, if we accept the official narrative, 9/11, and in the UK, 7/7, which was blowback because these countries supported these extremist groups. Well, literally a decade later, we have the United States and its regional allies, the good guys, the Arab family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, funding the same extremists in Libya. Belhaj was one such person. And of course, they overthrew the Libyan government. then, with the support of Erdogan and Turkey, they began the dirty war in Syria, where we had Operation Timber Sycamore, which was approved by Obama. And the interesting point is that thanks to WikiLeaks, we have the email, and your audience can search for it right now, where Jake Sullivan, who until a few months ago was the US National Security Advisor, sends an email. He sends his email to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State back then, saying that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. So a decade after 9/11, 7/7, less than a decade after 7/7, Al-Qaeda is working with the United States again. And ISIS is Al-Qaeda. ISIS was a part of Al-Qaeda which broke away. So the West, through its proxies, through its regional allies, again began spreading ISIS and Al-Qaeda for its own strategic purposes. Yet at the same time as it was doing this, with the help of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others, and the president of Turkey, it was constantly demonizing Iran. So the point that I want to make is that the narrative in the Western media, just as it has been very one-sided and supportive of the Israeli regime for the last 2 years, it is that narrative when it comes to Iran, I think, is very questionable, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, some of us can see through that narrative. I was just wondering if Chita, I'll get to Ross and Carne and Lale in a moment, but I know Chita has to go off. So, I mean, you kind of shared your views a moment ago, but do you want to say anything following Professor Marandi's comments, Chita?
No, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity again. But no, I enjoyed those comments, and I definitely look forward to hear from Carne and the other panelists.
Okay, so you're happy to move on. So yeah, Carne, you were shaking your head quite vigorously there. Would you like to explain why? It doesn't seem like you feel that America has supported these kind of groups, the Takfiri groups.
There's so many things to say. I greet my friend Chita, by the way, about Professor Marandi's extensive disquisition on the history of the Middle East. This romantic vision of Iran, I'm very uncomfortable with. I completely reject the notion that those who are critical of Iran are the same people who support Israel. That's an absurd and offensive notion. I'm deeply critical of what Israel has done ever since 1948, 67, you name it. I'm also frankly critical of Iran. This is a regime that represses the rights of women, where women activists have been killed by the security forces, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of political prisoners, where rather than not waging war, the Iranian government has waged a war against its internal minorities, in particular in the north, the Kurds. It has supported the most despicable, despotic regime of recent years in Syria, the Assad dictatorship, which is responsible for 500,000 deaths of Syrians who wanted nothing but democracy. The idea that the Americans triggered this by supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS is, I think, completely wrong. I am no apologist for American policy in Syria or Iran. I'm very critical of it. But this kind of sweeping sort of analysis of what's going on in the Middle East is, I think, way too simplistic and lets Iran off the hook for its own repressive behavior.
But we're not talking about the domestic politics of Iran. What Iran needs, can I say my bit? What Iran needs is a space to govern itself. And you have to be honest that since its whole modern history, Reza Shah, before his son, and then Mossadegh, everyone knows about Mossadegh, yeah? That it's like Reza Shah was abdicated, his son was put in charge, and the Mossadegh, which was a very popular leader, that was a CIA coup, everyone knows about that, and the British were heavily involved in that over, it was control of resources. Then there was the Iraq War, which was an American-funded war, and it's been non-stop. They literally haven't had a chance to govern themselves. If you care about when a country is treated like that, there's no surprise that they have very strong defensive strategies. They need the freedom to breathe, and it's kind of Orientalist, I feel, to judge those countries on how we live our freedoms. We need to give them that moment of freedom. They haven't had a moment of freedom. My family history, I come from a line of Baha'is, right? The Baha'is have been persecuted under Western governments, under all governments there. And even we realise, my mum, we all realise what's happened. We haven't had the space to breathe. Lale, would you like to comment?
I mean, it's quite interesting because, of course, Iran is a repressive regime, as is every other regime in the Middle East at the moment. But there is also something about this that the constant call to democratization has been pretty much since the end of the Cold War an excuse for launching wars against everybody in the region. You bring democracy with them at the point of a gun, at the barrel of a gun. One of the things that, until very recently, Israel was held up for was that it was the only democracy in the region, forgetting, for example, about Lebanon or about Turkey, indeed, or indeed any number of other countries which did have even that very basic way in which the US defines democracy, which is to hold elections and have free press. So I think that's I think that's neither here nor there. I think the question about Iran, and I want to also say this, you said you come from a line of Baha'is. I come from a line of communists who ended up going to prison in Iran. The reason that I left Iran in 1985 was because I wouldn't have been able to go to university in Iran. But I also recognize and acknowledge that the part of the reason that Iran has, every moment in which it has had a potentially more, let's say, liberal, political or economic opening, there has been a full-on attack against it by the United States and its little poodles in Europe. With apologies. The thing about it is that I think it's really important to recognize that during Khatami's time, who tried all sorts of methods of rapprochement, there was all sorts of ways that the US was still trying to undermine Iran. I think it's important to recognize that whenever Iran has had any possibility of an opening, there has been external attack. And under those circumstances, this state, which is also internally divided, like all of the states in the region again, is going to become paranoid. And it has become paranoid to the point that it sees in any kind of a challenge an existential sort of attack.
Yeah.
And some of that is, of course, correct, because the US has been indeed funding, for example, minority organizations, minority groups in the region, all around the country.
Yeah.
And I think that that's all, there is proven infiltration of the country. We know this because of the fact that apparently Israel had special operations forces on the ground.
Yeah.
Who directed the drones to attack some of the buildings that were brought down. Both Iran and Israel admit that. So Iran is going to become paranoid if it is going to be infiltrated in this manner. It has had allies also in the region, and there is also some discussion of this sort of these alliances or these proxies being cynical ways to extend Iranian power. That's Hezbollah, for example.
They need allies. Right.
They need allies, but there are reasons why Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, would absolutely and entirely need a more powerful ally. And of course, that alliance was found in Iran. What to me is again also interesting is that there is an entire subcurrent of history in most of the region that tends to ignore the fact that many of the radical groups that have emerged in the region or have emerged in particular parts of the region actually come out of an anti-imperialist tradition, which tended to be lefty until the left was put down. A large number of the people in southern Lebanon who were members of the Hezbollah, if you went back one generation, in fact their parents probably, are all communists. If you go to the south of Iraq, the Shia Shuyu'iyya, the communists and the Shia, there was a total connection between the oil workers who were communists and then became kind of a Shia radicals. They are not necessarily paragons to be held up as sort of role models, but nevertheless, we're not looking for innocent victims. We're looking for people who are struggling under extreme imperialist conditions, where Israel on the one hand, and then US's little allies, the kingdoms in the region, on the other hand, are actually acting as I don't know, soldiers, foot soldiers for this kind of an imperial expansion. I think that's really important to talk about. And I actually also think that this didn't necessarily, the strategic importance of Israel that did go back to from 1948, but with the US particularly from 1967. It may be Israel, if one looks at the country detrimentally since 1991, since the end of the Cold War, as being a kind of a strategic detriment to the US, but so is Texas. I mean, if we imagine Israel to be Texas on the Mediterranean, basically a US settler colony on the Mediterranean that serves US interests in the region, not only strategically, but also as a place where US economic and technological inventions are cycled through and tested. If we imagine Israel to be this space in which the US can ensure its strategic dominance and use the country as a kind of a soldier that can do this sort of thing so that the US has plausible deniability in its involvement, then it becomes clear that, in fact, the US and Israel are much more closely interwoven for that reason, that their interests are very much more convergent. And in those instances, I think Trita's analysis about how Iran serves as a threat to Israel, no matter what or whom is in power, there, becomes clear that if this is going to be an Israeli world in which Israel can use the whole place as a sandbox in which it does whatever the hell it wants to, it becomes clear that, of course, it's going to be able to do so with the US support, and Iran is a threat to that.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we have to think twice, people in the West, about judging Iran, because you just, unless you take a leap in empathy, and if you want to help the people of Gaza, we need to take a leap in empathy. And we're part of the imperial power here. We can't imagine, unless you're from that country or are very emotionally connected to that country, it's not the same value judgment, is it? It's not the same set of rules. So we have to think twice about those kind of judgments. And I think there's still a long way to go in terms of people in the West and how they perceive Iran.
But can I also say that emotional engagement
is... Make a comment because I have to leave shortly.
Oh, sorry, what was that, Professor?
Yes, if it's possible, I'll comment, and then because I have to leave in a bit.
Okay, go on.
Well, first of all, I think insults are not a sign of rationality, reason, logic, or evidence. And also, misrepresentation does not help either. Maybe I misheard, but I think one of your speakers said that I said that those who oppose Iran support Israel. I don't know if he was awake or asleep or...
No, that's what you said. You said it very clearly.
Well, anyone can go over the text or...
No, it's what you said. Let's be clear.
Or what I said, and one should be more honest in his assessment and in his statement. So this of course, was a dishonest statement on your behalf. I would also advise you to try this once when you speak from a position of superiority, to put a plastic bag over your head and try to breathe for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Because that's what happened to me when I was 17 years old. I was in the war, and Western regimes were the ones who were supporting Saddam Hussein and giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons. That nerve agent didn't allow me or anyone else to breathe. So I don't think you are in a position to talk about human rights. When I was 17, I confronted a nerve agent, but when I was 21, I survived a mustard gas attack. A mustard gas attack is something that the audience, they can look up on their cell phone and just look at some of the images. And what happens to people who survive or do not survive mustard gas. In one single instance, in the city of Halabja in Iraq, when the Iranian forces and the Kurdish forces and the Iraqi forces that were fighting alongside the Iranians liberated that city, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons and slaughtered 6,500 people, between 5,500 to 6,500 people in that city within minutes. I went to that city shortly after the chemical attack. The Iranians took Western journalists there. There was no condemnation. Nothing happened in the UN. Do you know when chemical weapons became an issue? It was after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, when the US president began to speak about Saddam having chemical weapons, but he did not say that it was the West that gave it to Saddam Hussein. So when you speak about repressive regimes, I feel I take this very personally, because your regime tried to kill me. Your regime killed many of my friends. Your regime slaughtered many children and strangled them, because in Halabja, they used the chemical agent that they used against me when I was 17. Plastic bag over your head. Imagine how those children died, how their mothers died, how their fathers died. So don't talk to me about human rights, because I've seen your human rights. And with regards to Syria, let me give you one piece of evidence. Although for you, evidence is not important. It's all emotion and misrepresentation. In 2012, the United States Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the most important and biggest military intelligence agency in the world, produced a document. That document was later released. In that document, it is said that the allies of the United States in the region want to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. Those allies, of course, are Turkey, Jordan, and these other countries that were contributing to the dirty war in Syria. That Salafist entity was ISIS. And then General Michael Flynn, people can look it up. He had an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, where he admitted that the United States supported the creation of this Salafist entity between Iraq and Syria, meaning ISIS. I'll go further. The then US Secretary of State, after Hillary Clinton, who Jake Sullivan sent his email to, after Hillary Clinton, the next US Secretary of State, and I'm not even going to bother with British government officials, the US Secretary of State, Kerry, in a leaked audio at the UN building, says explicitly that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus in order to put pressure on the Syrian government. So I don't think the United States, the UK government, or the Europeans are in any position to talk about human rights in Iran, especially since the MEK terrorist organization, which murdered up to 17,000 Iranians and fought as foot soldiers for Saddam Hussein. Your audience can look it up, MEK, the Mujahideen Khal. They have offices across Europe. In one instance, when I was 15 or so, I was getting ready to go to school. They blew up a bomb near my house on Shariati Street, close to Talagani Street. I'm just giving these names as evidence so that tomorrow your guest does not misunderstand what I've said. They blew up a bomb there, killing 9 or 11 people. I don't remember if it was 9 or 11, including an Armenian family of 4, because at that time I lived in a mixed neighborhood, in that area has lots of Armenians. An Armenian family, a father and mother and their children who they're taking to school were among those killed. The windows of our house were all blew up. They broke. The MEK terrorist organization is based in Europe and North America. If we had terrorist organizations in Iran that were carrying out terror attacks across the West and across the UK, what would the response be? So let's not talk about human rights, international law. Let's not make this about Iran, because if Iran is repressive, what does that say about your government? A government which has actively supported an apartheid regime since its inception. A regime that has been carrying out ethnic cleansing and genocide, not just for the past 2 years, but ever since the Nakba. We've seen it being carried out in one form or another. In fact, the creation of this regime, which is considered to be a democracy and a beacon of democracy across the Western world. Today, they're carrying out genocide. You're disgusted by my country. Use that plastic bag for 10 minutes and then you'll think again. But one final point, and that is, I think the host, she mentioned Mossadegh. Dr. Mossadegh, when he was in power, and this is something that, again, the audience can look up, when he was the prime minister, the same ugly demonizations that we see about Iran day and night in the Western media, that the same language was used against him until he was overthrown. Whether it was the New York Times or any other media outlet, he was depicted as a madman, as a fool, as someone who's linked to the communists, someone who's going to hand Iran over to the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So my proposal to your audience is to rethink many of the things that you've been hearing about the whole region. And for those who are interested, they can read books about Iran, such as, there are not very many books that I can think of right now. One is an older book by Flint and Hillary Leverett. Flint and Hillary Mann Leverett. Hillary is Jewish. Flint is Catholic. Both worked in the White House. Flint resigned as the head of the Middle East in the U.S. National Security Council under Condoleezza Rice. He resigned over Iraq, the war in Iraq. And Hillary, she was the head of the Persian Gulf. Both of them who worked in the White House wrote a book later on about Iran. They visited Iran multiple times, and their assessment of Iran differs immensely from what one of your guests has said. But in any case, I thank all of you for listening, but my advice is that any attempt to draw focus away from the Holocaust in Gaza is an injustice to the Palestinian people. And in my opinion, in many cases, it's a willful decision to do injustice to the Palestinian people. what is happening today in Gaza is an unprecedented horror in human history. Never before in human history has a Holocaust been carried out live in front of a global audience, with impunity, with impunity, with impunity, and where apologists day and night try to draw attention away from it or try to justify it. Just like in Iran, we hear that the Palestinians are intentionally imposing hunger among their own people and all sorts of ridiculous narratives, other narratives. But people see through it today.
I hope you can
In any
stay
case,
on.
I thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I hope everyone remains active in supporting the Palestinian people, and regardless of what anyone thinks about Iran, which I support, and I'm proud that I'm in Iran and I live in Iran, and I invite those who are friendly to Iran to travel to Iran. But regardless of all that, the focus should be on Gaza, the Palestinian people, and hopefully your audience and people across the UK will contribute to putting greater pressure on Western regimes that are implicated in this Holocaust. They are partners.
Sorry, I'm
Thank you
being.
very much.
Thank you, Professor Marandi. We
Thank
just
you.
gave, because both Professor and Treaty Party had to leave, whereas these two could stay on for a bit. That's why he had a bit more airtime there. So, like, the way I look at it, you know, this is really about imperialism. And, you know, like, we can all look at horror at the pictures of what's happening in Gaza, but we need to understand this. And the way I understand it fully is understanding imperialism and understanding power. So power isn't equally distributed. We can judge, like, loads of regimes or governments around the world and judge them, but if they're being dominated by imperial powers, it's not the same. We have to look at ourselves, and it really is a fight for resources as well. So Professor Marandi mentioned Mossadegh, and as we know, that was all about oil. So do you want to talk to the audience a little bit about that and the fight for resources then and now?
I think that I think it's really the longer history of imperial engagement, British, French, and then the United States in the Middle East, goes beyond the question of resources, because I think even before oil was discovered in Iran in 1909, there was a sense that the region was significant as a strategic outpost, but also as a significant route to India or to Asia more generally. That explains in part why the Suez Canal, for example, was dug at the end of the 19th century, or almost 1860s. It explains why the British appointed themselves kind of a policeman of the seas and signed treaties with the various emirates that ended up becoming the sort of ruling families of the Gulf. And it explains why, actually, until well into the beginning of the 20th century, the British considered southern Iran, for example, a sphere of their own influence, and competed with the Russians in the north in trying to dictate Iranian politics. So there's been quite a lot of strategic reasons for the area being a significant sort of milieu of struggle between different European imperial powers. But once oil was discovered, and of course, I mean, this is a history that you guys all probably know, so saying, repeating it is, forgive me, but in 1912, Churchill, who was then the head of Admiralty, switched the ships, the Admiralty ships, essentially the British naval ships, from coal to oil. And then from that moment onwards, oil ended up becoming an important, not only resource for energy, because it didn't become that until actually the mid-20th century, but a very significant strategic resource, because then naval vessels could be using it. This was also at a time where you had wheeled weaponry, so tanks and various other kinds of personnel carriers ended up becoming important. So you needed oil also for gasoline or petrol for those. So essentially, petroleum at that moment was a kind of a war producing, a war feeding weapon and tool.
Do you mind if I just cut to Carne there? Because, you know, you resigned over Iraq and obviously, you know, as we all know through reflection, oil was a big part of that. I mean, how do you, you know, reflect on that period? That, you know, what were the decisions that made you quit, and how do you picture it all? How do you put it together?
Well, I'm wondering how to respond to the last half an hour, where Professor Marandi has been lecturing us about the virtues of the Iranian regime uninterrupted.
Well, the reason, can I just say, no, he was going, that's why I didn't interrupt him.
So. The only person you've interrupted is me, but anyway.
I just interrupted Lale, actually.
No, you've interrupted me twice now. I've spoken far less than anybody else, but I don't care about that. Right. What I care about is that a story about human rights and democracy is being suppressed here and thrown into a kind of generalized kind of, if you are critical of human rights abuses in Iran, that somehow you support American hegemony, that you support the Zionist project, that you have no right to talk about human rights. My indices of judgment are very simple. They are, number one, assessments of human rights. Number two, assessments of democracy, in particular women's rights. And number three, the voices of people from the ground. I take the voices of Palestinians far more seriously than I take the voices of BBC News presenters. I take the voices of Iranian women far more seriously than I do the voices of the Iranian government or indeed my own government. And likewise in Syria, I've worked for a very long time with the Syrian opposition. I continue to work with parties in Syria, and what they have told me about what the Assad regime did is horrific. I noticed that Professor Marandi didn't even mention Iran's support for Syria. It can't just be brushed off as you in the West have no right to mention this. It's obscene. Iran, along with Russia, was the main supporter of the Assad regime, which is responsible for the deaths of 500,000 people, including people I know who were tortured to death in the most vile manner possible. And I don't think that can be just swept under the carpet. And I'm afraid it tells a rather more complicated story of what has happened in the Middle East than just, the West has created this disaster. Of course, the West is, as the imperial powers, both today and in the past, has a huge responsibility for what has happened, for the disaster in Palestine, the nature of Syria itself, etc., etc. But it is not so simple as just blaming the West for every phenomenon in the Middle East, in particular things like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I was in New York on the 11th of September 2001. I was working on the Middle East at the UN for the British, and I'll come on to your question in a minute. There is no question in my mind that this was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. They perpetrated it for various complex reasons, which were not paid attention to and should have been paid attention to. But it was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, and many thousands of civilians died, again, in a horrible manner. And I just don't think these kind of things can be, generalized about that, the Americans created Al-Qaeda, they created ISIS. I mean, this is an absurd analysis. Anyhow, to come to your question, the the reason for the Iraq War was 9/11. It was because the American government was found wanting in the core responsibility of governments, which is to provide security for their populations. And the American government responded by lashing out at the nearest target. And the neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, and others saw their opportunity, just as the extremists in Israel see their opportunity in October the 7th. The neocons in America saw their opportunity to introduce an idea they had long been lobbying for, which is the removal of Saddam Hussein as part of a theory of change in the whole Middle East, that there would be a kind of domino effect. Absurd as this theory is, but this is what they believe, that if you knocked over Saddam, there would be a kind of uprising of democracy across the Middle East, that the removal of one dictatorship would lead to the removal of authoritarians all through the region. This is a ridiculous idea, of course. The excuse of weapons of mass destruction, the Americans didn't care that much about that, and they told us that in bilateral talks which I attended. The reason we talked about weapons of mass destruction and the threat was the Brits, because Tony Blair needed the authority of the UN Security Council to bring his own party and parliament on board to support this war, who, naturally they were initially very skeptical of it. So the whole issue of the threat of WMD was talked up by the Brits in an attempt to get authorization from the UN Security Council, which they, in the end, did not get. So it is more complicated than just the WMD lie. It wasn't. It was an exaggeration of what the British knew, and they attempted to force a situation where the weapons inspectors, and I set up the weapons inspection body UNMAVIC, would be, they expected, interfered with by the Iraqi government, and therefore give casus belli to the Anglo-Americans. And for once, the Saddam regime did not interfere with the inspections. They actually cooperated with the inspections, as Hans Blix testified, a man I knew well and have great faith in.
Okay, so, you mentioned that Al-Qaeda, it's not as simplistic as saying America created it, but it's not the mainstream line, and America had a lot to do with the creation of Al-Qaeda. And how we're talking about Iran now and its enrichment of uranium, and not discussing the fact that Israel has at least 90 weapons of mass destruction. It's not part of the NPT. What have we learned from Iraq? We're still peddling. You sort of implied that I'm being biased, but I feel that I'm the silenced voice. In the mainstream, my voice isn't the voice you hear, right? So we have a long way to go if we don't want to repeat those mistakes. What would you say about that, especially the comment that it's not as simplistic as America creating Al-Qaeda?
I'm in agreement with you. Voices like yours need to be heard. A much more sensible, non-belligerent approach needs to be taken to Iran. One of dialogue, and I have long felt that, and Trita has argued this more cogently than I can, I have long felt that a deal is possible with Iran. The JCPOA that was agreed by the Obama administration was an example of the deal that could have been done. And part of the motivation in that administration was to stop the Israelis attacking Iran, because the Obama administration realized how destructive that would be. So there is a diplomatic and negotiated solution that's available, and to engage in an illegal attack on Iran instead, as Israel and America have just done, is utterly reprehensible, and does, like Israel's assault and genocide of the Palestinian people, does grave damage to the rule of international law, which involves all of our security ultimately. So it's not just Palestinian lives and Iranian lives, it's in fact all of our security that is at stake here.
Yeah, because there's something that is being ramped up, which is the emboldening of authoritarian powers here, as we saw with the recent prescription ruling with direct action, and Yvette Cooper and Dan Jarvis are talking about prescribing Iranian government bodies, not just the IRGC, but also the Ministry of Intelligence. This is a complete flouting of any diplomatic processes. Israel walked away from the negotiation table recently. So how can we build up trust? And it's not just about helping people there. It really is about helping us here. What would you say about that? Like, how can we fight this sort of rise of authoritarianism here?
I mean, I think that the only way that actually our governments can be pressured is for popular mobilization. And I think one of the things that I have been deeply impressed with, I think Trita also mentioned this, as did Marandi, is the fact that there's an entire generation of youth that are not necessarily buying any of the things that are being sold to them. And I think both in the United States, where many of them at the cost of being thrown out of their universities or being arrested or being deported, in fact, have managed to organize. And here I know a number of members of Palestine Action, and I'm deeply impressed with their direct action activities. And the reason that I think they have been prescribed is precisely because they have been effective in bringing attention. And I think that part of what I've also been very impressed, and I think whatever organization is going on behind the scenes is what we really need to support, is the extent to which an older generation has stepped forward and put their bodies on the line by getting arrested again and again and again on the street in order to draw attention to the illegality and authoritarian power here. So I think there is something shifting in the ground, on the ground. I don't think that it's necessarily. As a daughter of revolutionaries, I put my trust in popular power rather than in governments, in part because governments have done nothing. And we seem to have be living in a state of democratic deficit where popular will and popular demands and popular opinions are simply not finding a way to influence those who have ostensibly been elected to represent us. That there's an entire process by which that connection between the popular will, the massive polity and its politics, both here and in the US, but also elsewhere in Europe, for example, the places that are supposed to be cradles of democracy, that connection between the polity and the people that represent them seems to have been severed in a lot of places. And I do wonder what the solution would be to that. Perhaps organizing at a much smaller, sorry?
I can tell you what the solution is. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go on ahead. No, tell me.
Well, a bottom-up revolution of self-government and taking autonomy and agency for ourselves.
And I think that some of that is happening. I mean, I see the way that you have across the sort of what I would call it as a left spectrum, from anarchists doing mutual aid organizing, and of course a lot of the people that are involved in Palestine Action are anarchists as they're communists, and they're doing all sorts of things. There are people that are in the Democratic Center, and they're trying to organize their politics. There's the new Corbyn Party. There are the people that are standing, for example, for green elections. I'm a member of the Greens and voted for Zach Polanski. So I mean, there is obviously and then there are and I think I've always been very skeptical of law as a space of power, but I have to say Francesca Albanese has kind of brought me on side, because what she has done is she has shown us that the law can be used as a space of contention, not necessarily as some kind of a top-down edict from on high, but as a form of putting pressure. So there are also popular legal organizations, ELSC, the European Legal Support Center, which supports people that have been screwed over because of their pro-Palestinian mobilizing. I think that there are all these different spaces, and I think we have to do what we can do at the moment to put pressure on. What I worry about is, again, the timing, because right now people are starving in Palestine and they're being bombed while they're being starved. So even if the aid is being dropped on tents, killing people also, Israel is still talking about going in and expanding the war. I don't know what else they're going to expand it to. There's 42 million tons of rubble. This is one of the most polluted spaces on earth right now, the cleaning of which nobody's even talking about. Never mind how that place is going to be livable for the 1 million+ people that hopefully have survived this travesty. So what can happen in the short term? I don't know.
I think I agree with everything that Lala said. I think a couple of things in addition. One is we are in Britain. We're not there. We have to hammer our own government for its own complicity in genocide. I did a talk about this the other day, that under the Genocide Convention, complicity is a separate crime. It's not just a sort of political point. It's a separate individual crime under the Genocide Convention. And I think, there's no question that Israel is committing genocide according to, very clear criteria. You don't have to take years to reach that conclusion, as the government seems to imply. You only have to look at the ICJ opinion and the conditions that it demanded of Israel following that opinion, and Israel has not respected a single one of those conditions, including, for instance, the enabling of food and water and humanitarian aid to reach the Palestinian people. So I'm afraid it's abundantly clear that Israel has committed genocide. Secondly, it's abundantly clear that our government is complicit in it by providing, for a long time, weapons. Even now, they've only stopped 30 out of 300 licenses for weapons supplies. They continue to conduct Royal Air Force surveillance flights over Gaza. In fact, they boast about it at receptions given by the Israeli ambassador, who is herself, by the way, a génocidaire, somebody who supports genocide. She's quoted to that effect. So we should press on that point using evidence rather than just kind of making generalized claims. The government has lied in Parliament about its complicity. It is legally vulnerable, in my view, on the Genocide Convention. And these are the areas where I think we need to hammer the government for what it has done and hold those responsible, in future responsible, see them prosecuted. I'd like to see them prosecuted in the ICC. Just as we have not seen Blair and Campbell and others prosecuted for their role in enabling the Iraq War. Instead, we see Campbell presenting a successful podcast and presenting the Channel 4's coverage of the election. This is a man who's responsible for the deaths of people I know, including the weapons scientist David Kelly, who was a close colleague of mine and indeed a friend. That's one thing. The second thing is slightly different, which is we need to develop a more sophisticated narrative about what needs to happen in the Middle East. I'm afraid to say, America supported the production, created Al-Qaeda as just sort of, and whoever opposes Iran is supporting Israel. This kind of narrative is simply not good enough. We have to develop a sophisticated policy narrative, policy proposal even, about how the Middle East should be handled. Because, it's an epic fuck up from start to finish. And that approach, in my view, needs to be rights-based, that we talk about equality of human rights across the board in every country. That means, of course, in the Gulf monarchies. It means in Saudi Arabia. We don't support these countries unless they respect human rights. We don't support Egypt, which imprisons 70,000 political prisoners. And indeed, we criticize Iran, not on the typical grounds that it's threatening Israel, but on the grounds that it doesn't respect human rights. And I think a rights-based approach gives a consistency and eradicates the historic hypocrisy of the West in the Middle East. And that ought to be the narrative that we're talking about.
I think we should sort our rights here first before we have anything to say about the Middle East. I agree with what you're saying completely.
I'm not saying one or the other.
Yeah, I know. Like you're saying, it's complex, and but I do think there a lot of self-reflection needs to be addressed about how we have done things, and it is a very different position when we are the stronger power. There's no denying that, right? And in terms of a system based on human rights, what about capitalism and just resources? I mean, how do we deal with that whopper? That's the root of all of this. It's like how we've wanted things very unequal. We haven't wanted fair capitalism. If we had that, the Middle East wouldn't be a monumental F up, would it? So how do we address that issue?
I think there is. It's kind of funny that this all goes back historically to the division between political rights and social rights, but also it goes back to the fact that ultimately rights have been weaponized by those in power. So it really does come down, in some senses, to the question of power, because. As you say, Sisi has 75,000 people subjected to all sorts of horrendous in prisons and prison camps, and the kind of some of the things that are, for example, happening in Sinai, to the Bedouin in Sinai, under the Sisi regime, which we don't even hear about. So, yes, Iran does have tens of thousands of people in prisons. I think we should also talk about that. But my concern is that in a moment in which all of the great powers, with absolutely no one to stand in their way, is honing their view onto a country that seems to be the only one really standing against Israel, and attacks that country on the basis of a whole series of things that under ordinary circumstances, if every other factor was set aside, you're absolutely right. The travesty of human rights there is terrible. But it seems to me that, again, kind of, in this moment, it just... it seems to be to excuse, to some extent, an attack on Iran. I don't think you're doing it, but I do think that it is used to excuse that.
No, I agree. I think that's very true. The government's use of human rights as a weapon, as a tool of criticism, is totally selective. It's done with the most obscene and obvious hypocrisy. And I think we ought to call our own government to account for it. I agree with you that we should address rights in our own country. I don't think first we can do both at the same time. We are actors. We have voices. I am friends with a great many people in the region. I continue to work in Syria. My work is devoted to elevating the voices of local people in decisions about them. And that seems to me a principle that we should all follow, rather than developing our own sort of narratives about what's going on. We should listen to them. They know the answers. They know what needs to happen in their countries, and their voices should be absolutely paramount. And you can hear them. Social media is a wonderful thing in some ways. It's terrible in others, but it does allow you to hear, from ordinary Kurds in the northeast, from Alawites who are being subjected to massacres in Latakia, and of course from Palestinians under attack in Gaza. Those voices are there, and it's incumbent on us to listen to them, and they will say lots of things, lots of different things. They are complicated, they are sometimes divided, just like we are. And the sort of monolithic approach to the Middle East of essentializing Iran, essentializing Israel or Palestine or Syria in the way that that gentleman just did, is itself a form of Orientalism. This is exactly what Said was on about, the essentialization of different races and countries. Each of these countries is a complicated amalgam of different ethnicities, different religions, different experiences, whether they're Kurdish or Alawite or Hashemite, whatever. And, that has got to be our guiding light. And that implies a kind of great humility on our part about, what we say about there. I noticed that we haven't had a single question or anything.
Questions start at 7:30, but yes,
well, it's
I
7:30.
agree. Maybe we can have some influence on the domestic human rights issues, but the big whopper is the fact that we're not in a country that are dealing with dominance from the rest of the world, right? So I think it's just like you just
I don't
need.
know. Trump got on a plane.
Well,
and
yeah,
came
well,
here.
we are, satellite state to America, but we're quite happy in that role, apparently. Well, that's what we need to address, actually, But what I would say, we have a level of comfort that isn't experienced by people in the Middle East. We don't have that level of chaos and agony that they have over there. And I think they would just want space from that, and just the basic human rights, the basic right to have sovereignty and have a bit of space and have equal global capitalism, if that's even possible, but just to have some sort of mutual respect before we start to judge them on how they treat each other. That, like, I believe if we give them that space, they can govern themselves. Iran has a very, very long history of statescraft, going back thousands of years. And it is pompous of us to assume that they can't govern themselves until we fix this massive disparity between power in the East and the West.
I think that also brings up the question of, as you said, capital. And I think that in some senses is also the elephant in the room. My sense is that part of this, the Israel essentially going on a rampage in the region, is part of a larger project of de-development. Sarah Roy, a long time ago, wrote something about how Israel's plans in the occupied Palestinian territories was to de-develop those. But it seems to me that is also a plan that is happening in a huge swathe of the Middle East, where successive wars and sanction regimes and various other kinds of conflicts, both internal and externally driven, have actually resulted in the vast majority of the population in the Middle East not living up to the standards that they could have lived had there not been this external intervention again and again and again. And so I think that's also something that is perhaps stopping the war fighting could be one of the first things that we could that could be significant in trying to address and arrest this backward move in terms of economic equality, in terms of social rights, in terms of simply the ability to build infrastructures that may survive for 10 years rather than be bombed by an external power. This has been a plan of Israel's, which has done so on behalf of the US. I'm not one of those people that thinks that Israel runs different countries in the world. I do think that Israel is a servant of the United States. I really do think that it acts a little bit like Texas in the region. And I think that it is very significant for us to recognize this because I think this acting on behalf of the power centers to keep the region under the thumb is affected through war fighting. And they are superior with that. And the reason that they're superior with it is because they're constantly funded by the United States.
Yeah.
As Trita pointed out, the part of the Camp David Accord was a guarantee by the United States to constantly and forever support Israel's military edge. And also ensure, it's one of the other elements of that was to ensure that it was always going to get energy. So, and it has done so.
I think it's one very helpful lens to understand all of this is, of course, the imperialist or post-imperialist lens that Israel is engaged in an imperialist project to create a greater Israel at the expense of Palestinian land and lives. But I think more broadly, the post-imperial lens helps us in understanding Western policy in the Middle East, and in particular, the consonance, the co-identity of the needs of capital and racism. There's no question that one of the reasons Palestinians are being allowed to die in such numbers is pure racism. It is the diminution of Arab peoples into a sort of homogenous other, of which we've been aware for so long, but it is being perpetrated every single day. And there was an economic component to that in imperialism, that imperialism was driven by a notion of capital expansion and the economic exploitation, and racism was the way it was done. It was the way it was perpetrated, and we're seeing a version of that today. In the West's forcing of governments into this kind of, one of the things as an anarchist that really troubles me is the way that Western governments accept that there are these hierarchical authoritarian governments in charge of Arab countries who centralize all resources under them, centralize all state authority under them. And in some way that's kind of unstated, people like the Brits think that they kind of recognize themselves in this, the centralized state that has full authority over the people. At the moment, British policy on Syria is very much to support a centralized Syria, one Syria, as if this is a thing worth having in itself, a country that became one Syria under the French mandate, of course. And I think it's a kind of deep-seated statist, which is also capitalist view of how countries should actually be. When in fact, I remember talking to a young Tunisian woman at the time of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, and she said to me, "We don't want to be like you in the West. We don't want your so-called democracy," and by which she meant, the democracy that we have that is utterly poisoned by capitalism and is rendered unrepresentative by capitalism. We want our own power. The young man, well, he's not so young, Abdel al-Fattah, who is probably the best known political prisoner in Egypt, who is also British, he's British Egyptian. I had the privilege of walking around Washington Square Park with him several years ago, and he's basically an anarchist. He doesn't believe in the Western democracy no more than he believes in Sisi's centralized state. So I think this is another way that we need to develop a more sophisticated approach to talking about the Middle East.
Of course, I get what you're saying. We have to go to Q&A now, but I do think we have to do our best as Westerners to really look at how we abuse our power, because it's going to bite us in the butt, quite frankly. And we should really reserve our judgment about how they want to govern and any of it. I don't think we have a right to judge any country in the whole global South. Actually, we need to sort ourselves out. So, time for Q&A. So, Professor Heim, I can see your hands up. Do we have a mic for? Is it this one? Okay. All right.
Mike, I agree with a lot of what Lale has said. Well, actually, all of it. But I want to ask Carl a question, because what I didn't think I was going to hear today is Western wisdom about other nations and other cultures. And I find that I'm an anti-Zionist Israeli, and I was really offended by what you said, because you said we can come to an agreement with Iran. We can, talk and work it out. Neither you nor any British politician, alive or dead, has ever said we can come to an agreement with Israel. We can make sure that they have no nuclear weapons, that they don't occupy Palestine, that they don't take the rights of every single Palestinian, that they don't destroy countries in the whole of the Middle East. And I could go on for a half an hour, and I'm sure you know that. So why is it, I think that you can take the man out of the system, but sometimes you can't take the system out of the man. And I hear the system when you speak. despite the kind of politicized that. And the system is Western, the system is Islamophobic, the system is a controlling mechanism against international law. You didn't say a single word about international law. You talked about rights. Well, there is no one in the Middle East that has rights apart from the Israelis. Yeah. Now, Israel is indeed a democracy. You know why? Because 93% of the Israeli Jews, through a number of polls, have voted for the genocide. So this is a democratic genocide, and you're supporting it by British policy for 110 years. For 110 years, Britain has supported, has enabled, had made possible the crimes of Zionism. Now, just to end, I want to say that the idea that Israel is just a servant of the Middle East is the only thing I don't accept what you said, Lala. This is not a dog, or if it is a dog, sometimes that dog is waved by its tail. So I cannot see how what Israel is doing is serving the British population, the French population, the German population, the US population. I think that actually what Israel is occupied is not just the Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese. It occupied the Western mind, and we hear an example of that today.
I must listen. I was talking about Iran when I said we need to reach an understanding with them. I have a very, very long history in writing and in video of criticizing Israel and criticizing my own country for abandoning international law over and over again. So I think it's a little bit unfair to caricature my position as being somehow ignoring international law when it comes to Israel. On the contrary, international law on Israel and Palestine is very clear and has been ignored by the West in a way that is totally disgraceful and hypocritical. So I think we are in total agreement about that. British policy, official policy towards Israel and Palestine has been a disgrace since the Mandate period. I don't believe in a two-state solution. I don't believe in the Oslo process. I believe that was an abandonment of fundamental Palestinian rights, including the right to self-determination. If I believe in anything, and it is for the people of Israel and Palestine to decide this together, not for me, in an equal way, not in a way where one side is supported by the global hegemon. If I believe in anything, it is as of a single state solution with rights for Arabs and Jews in equality. I know that seems like a pipe dream in the current situation. I think that the British government's position over the last 2 years has been an utter disgrace. And I think the people concerned should be held accountable and prosecuted for it. But I also think that some of the bromides that are offered in this country in terms of the debate, such as recognition for a Palestinian state, such as the two-state solution itself, are a complete red herring in terms of what is going on now, where we are confronting an imperialist, colonialist project driven by extremists in an extremist Israeli government that wishes to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and indeed beyond, as we see in southern Syria and southern Lebanon and perhaps elsewhere. And that is the reality we ought to be talking about, and how to deal with that reality is what we should be talking about. We didn't really have a chance to talk about Palestine, and
it's not 2 years; it's 110 years.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. No, I totally agree. We're in agreement.
Okay. Sorry, Matt from Migration Films. Question for Lala, only for both of you, really. With all the evidence of the Israeli lobby, UK laws for Israel, Yvette Cooper receiving £200,000, AIPAC in America.
Absolutely. How is it that Israel is not ruling?
Well, yeah. I mean, how can you think that? That's
so can I just say, the moment that the United States changes tack on Israel, so will the government here. So that answers that. I mean, it's very comfortable. And I don't deny that there are people that are entirely principled that will not take that money and are not dictated by it. But I don't think that that's why they do it. I think the entirety of the foreign policy apparatus of this country does what the United States wants it to do, as does the rest of the NATO. In the US, it's a slightly different situation. In the US, you have a country that sort of, claims to be democratic, but it's one of the most undemocratic places I have ever seen. Only about 50% of the people engage in any kind of active politics. So 50 other percent are basically disenfranchised. And those that do engage in politics don't find the channel through which they can organize. Now, there is a lot of stuff going on where you have grassroots movements trying to copy what the right wing started doing in the 1980s and taking over, school committees and municipalities and blah, blah, in order to build power from below. But there is a massive disconnect between the way the system is run at the top and the bottom. And as you know, I mean, I'm sure every election we get a lesson in how incredibly undemocratic the entirety of edifice of US politics is, with the Senate, for example, giving more vote to empty spaces in Wyoming than it does to millions of people in California, or with the electoral.
On 36 members of the Senate, Israeli citizens.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I think it's actually.
I don't want to start talking about dual nationals, though. I would be a dual national too. I'm a triple national, and that actually makes me suspect in all three of the countries to which I belong. And so that discourse of dual nationality is not somewhere I really want to go.
Okay.
I would go further in my critique of the British position. It's not just poodleism, and God knows I've seen the poodleism up front. I remember going to the State Department many, many times and having long talks with them about Iraq policy, where essentially they would be giving us instructions and we would pretend to kind of have a discussion with them about those instructions, but essentially it was a one-way session of them telling us what we should do. But it's worse than that in Britain, because there is also this deep-seated mindset that somehow Britain has a role in the Middle East. And you saw it when David Lammy spoke at the UN, that somehow the Balfour Declaration gives us some kind of standing in the Middle East to kind of pontificate about how it should be shaped. That Britain's shift on recognition is dramatically different from, say, Norway doing it because of our historic role. I mean, needless to say, you ask Israelis or Palestinians what they think about Britain's historic role, and it is only slightly above Germany's historic role in Israel's history. That's how much we're hated in the Middle East, and in Israel and Palestine in particular, for very good reason. And yet, the British establishment holds on to this pomposity that, we have some historic understanding of the Middle East. It's absolutely grotesque. And I think, again, it suggests to me that we should concentrate our fire on our own government and its own complicity in what's going on.
Sorry, there was one last part. Have you read that?
Yes, of course. Two men have asked questions, so you should give it to two. Okay, do you want to ask?
Oh, sure. Oh, okay. You're going to be next. Okay. She also. Yeah.
Thank you. We've had capitalism mentioned a couple of times, and imperialism and systems, but the word market hasn't come up. The M word hasn't come up. And Professor Khalili was quite right to remind us that Britain decided to join the First World War when warships changed from coal to oil. And most wars, maybe all wars, are fought for what happens afterwards. And that was the beginning of the whole market thing. And in fact, there was an expression back in the day, I'm talking about 13, 14 something, when warships were just starting to navigate the world for markets and goods. And something beyond their, or our, because I'm a Brit, sphere of comprehension was known as Irby dragons. Can't go there, there's dragons. And I think somewhere Iran as a dragon. Somewhere, lots of Middle Eastern countries are dragons, and they're beyond our ken, but not beyond our control. And I'm wondering if anyone's seen... Sorry, we also need to bear in mind the neoliberal system in which all this is occurring, which is supporting the elites and at the expense of the masses. I think we all know that. But I wonder, has anyone seen Adam Curtis's film Bitter Lake? Which is a very good account of, and I might be slightly at odds with one of the presenters from there, but Afghanistan, the Soviets didn't invade Afghanistan. I believe they were invited. It was
by the Najibullah regime, that's correct.
By a regime.
By the Najibullah regime, yes.
Were they not socialists?
I don't
Yes,
know.
they were. Yes, and they were popular and brought down. And I believe Bush funded the Taliban to beat them. So again, Afghanistan was sort of beaten back to an Irby Dragons type place after the
Mujahideen
socialist
was
government.
Supported by the West, that's right.
Yeah. So we need to look at the role of markets in all this. And wasn't Israel set with great moral certitude after the Second World War, where it was to control markets in the Middle East for the capitalist class?
So the history of establishment of Israel goes far back
Yes, to
before
Balfour
that.
and
So I think it actually
yeah.
goes back before that. And
Yeah.
I think in part, the question of markets and capitalism is where it comes in. Because in fact, some of the people that funded the original settlements in Israel were also the people that were funding settler colonialism in Algeria, French Algeria,
Right.
but also paying for the exploration of gold mines in South Africa and elsewhere. And so there is quite a long history at the end of the 19th century where settler colonialism was seen as a kind of a mode of European entry into these areas where there were resources that were wanted. So that history goes back beyond there. Then post Second World War, relocation of the displaced survivors of the Shoah was essentially a continuation of what had happened before that. And in fact, some of those earlier settlers, again, there's some really interesting histories of this, some of those earlier Jewish settlers actually did not want the surviving people that were displaced, or that were coming from the displacement camps. They found them to be, they used actually incredibly anti-Semitic language against them. Ben Gurion was apparently called some of them soap. So it wasn't a post 1945 thing. It goes back much further than that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I mean, before I pose several questions or a question or food for thought, my experience of being in the West Bank was wherever they went and they heard that British accent, it was, Balfour Declaration. So I just wanted to put that bit down. With everything that has been said, the West and the rest, these are all echoes of Stuart Hall and all these different arguments put forward, and you know, the last parts of colonialism and everything, and this obsession with what democracy should look like everywhere other than the West. And quite rightly so, when Professor Haim had pointed out about, you know, Israel's so-called democracy, we've got to, you know, what does democracy look like to you now? And this is about us at home. We have the freedom, or the so-called freedom, to be able to express, you know, our views. Want to stand on the right side of humanity, and yet we're the ones being punished out there, although it's a drop in the ocean to what goes on every single day for 100 years in Palestine. But, you know, what does it look like? And also, I you know, agree with lots that's been said, but I would really choose a different word to absurd for some of those theories, because, you know, reading John Pilgrim, lots of different, I can't think, I'm menopausal now, but so many different academics and professors from, you know, historically, there's always been, you know, Douglas Hurd with the briefcase going in before the Gulf War and things like that. You know, it is something that we need to look at, and hey ho, it will be the rise of the independents, because Labour and Tories and all these mainstream politicians have completely and utterly failed the voices of the people, and at the same time, the trickle effect is the rise of the far right. And when, I mean, I'm over 50, so when would you have ever seen, it's horrible to see, you know, Union Jacks or, you know, the English flag, which we should be proud of, you know, even though Paul Gilroy said there ain't no black in the Union Jack. But anyway, alongside with, you know, the Israeli flag now, when once upon a time, if you looked at the 80s fascist movements and things like that, you would never have seen those two things together. It's just bloody topsy-turvy. But democracy, I'll pose that to you.
Well, I mean, I don't believe we have a democracy in this country. I mean, it's called representative democracy, but it represents the interests of a minority, a small number of, I don't just mean Labour voters, I actually mean those who have access to influence government, and that's the wealthiest, that's corporations, and historically they have tilted government policy towards their own interests. And now we see the result of that, which is a huge and growing divide between a population enraged by their lack of opportunity, humiliated by their economic circumstance, and a government, that political parties that don't listen. I stood for the Greens in the last election, not that I believe in parliamentary politics, but that's another story. I was in Labour's I ran in Labour's 25th safest seat. And the thing you heard most of all on the doorstep was hatred of the system. It was a hatred of all politics, hatred of Labour, even though Labour was being elected in that place, partly because of Gaza, I'd note, but anyway. And that's what I believe. You know, I believe the system is utterly bankrupt and we need to replace it. Turkeys won't vote for Christmas, to put it in Christian terms, or Thanksgiving in America. They won't abolish or reform themselves. I think PR or reforming the House of Lords are complete red herrings. We need to reform the entire system of capitalism and so-called representative democracy, which are deeply entwined and reflective of each other. And the only way we can do that is by taking control of our own circumstances, taking control democratically, but also taking control of the workplace and the economy. You can't have one without the other. You can't deny agency in the workplace as well as deny it, but give it politically. You have to have agency in both realms. And I actually think that's an entirely plausible project. It sounds utopian. I don't see it as utopian. I actually think it is a plausible alternative to the grotesque offerings of the far right, who claim to speak for the common man, who claim to voice this humiliation, and only they tell the truth. I wish, you know, we would stop dabbling in partial solutions, but actually get to the deep structure of why things are like they are and attempt to change that. Everything is made by humans. We can change it.
I mean, I think it's really important to organize, to become involved, to, if you're working somewhere, join your union. If you're in a community, join the women's organization in your community, or join the refugee support organization in your community, or other forms of direct action. Support, I mean, there's lots of different ways to get engaged. And there's, of course, the revolutionary possibility, but that revolutions, as someone who's lived through one, never go exactly the way that you imagine them to go. And so it's kind of much harder to say, let's start a revolution today, unless we're willing to roll out guillotines outside.
I don't. For once, I find myself in disagreement with you. You know, when you replace one small group who run the country with another small group who claim to run it better, yes, you get the guillotine, because that group must repress opposition. I'm talking about something much more broad-based, and I don't also agree that it needs a critical mass. I think we could do it now. You know, this is the frustrating thing, is there's a kind of skepticism of possibility. I've read a lot of anarchist literature from the late 19th century when they were dealing with the horrors of Victorian industry, child labor, people being killed in large numbers in factories. And they believed in the possibility of a completely different society, a completely different notion of what humans were, one derived from Kropotkin's notion of mutual aid rather than survival of the fittest. There are deep philosophical foundations to this view of an alternative. And I'm really fed up with the kind of routine skepticism that you hear. Those who announce that routine skepticism are actually playing the game of the people who run the system, because those people who benefit from the system want us to believe that it's unreformable, that it's a natural status quo, that capitalism is how humans actually are, that we are naturally competitive, that we believe in dog eat dog, we are individuals rather than a society. I personally believe that humans only exist in relationship to one another, that we're never individuals. The idea of individual consumption as the goal of human society is a grotesquerie. And somehow intuitively, I think we all believe that. So, the notion that change is impossible is, I think, a deeply regressive posture to take, and one we have to reject.
Thank you for saying this. So I live with a young woman who's been arrested 9 times, and most recently with Defend Our Juries a couple of weeks ago. And so she also works for a food charity. And so we're being threatened about this. Do not protest because you're a terrorist. And it turns out that she's very photogenic. She was photographed a lot. And somebody who she works with said, guess what she's been up to? And because she works for an ethical food charity, their response was, do you think you could just stop getting arrested a bit, please? They didn't sack her. They didn't threaten her. She's impervious to threat. And what I wanted to ask was, so she's in her 30s, I'm 60. And when I went out to Palestine in my 30s, we didn't have our eyes weren't, we didn't have the horrors being fed into our living rooms. The average person couldn't see what was going on. We didn't have Instagram, we didn't have TikTok, we didn't have Facebook, and activists didn't have Signal or Telegram. So, I can only say that, I had to go there as a young person to understand what was going on. I had to get through checkpoints. I had to witness settlers. I had to go on protest there. I had to stand in front of bulldozers. I had to be there. And when I look at young people now running around with, a keffiyeh, I'm like, how do you know what's going on in Palestine? And it's because it's all on it. They're seeing it. They're being broadcasted. So my question is about tech and about this idea of bottom up. Because what I'm watching is young people organizing, using tech, living ethically, so being impervious to threat, being very savvy, self-organizing. And these are the people that we're seeing in America. We're seeing them here. When I saw the protest in Australia, Australia's a white-only country. And, 500,000 people turned up the other day. So something about tech has changed the power game. So all the big people up there used to be able to do what they want. I would never be able to come to this kind of a talk and listen to people who are very knowledgeable talk politics. But now everybody's in on it. Everybody can hear you. I can watch this program. We can all hear you now. And that's a 20-year, we've only had that for 20 years. I wonder what you all think about the way tech has displaced power and radicalized, been able to radicalize younger people.
I'm not 100% sure that tech is an unalloyed good. It is a surveillance mechanism. It's a way that it gathers up your information, and marketizes it. Yeah. And in fact, even something like signal or telegraph can be very easily used to monitor you. Technology was the way that Israel used to murder however many thousands of people in Lebanon. Technology is the way that Israel, for example, uses to send drones into tents and kill breastfeeding mothers. Technology is, in fact, right now, the biggest export of the country, and one of the closest way in which its systemic imbrication with the United States is affected. It's military, it's institutional, and it's technological. And I think that for that reason, I don't necessarily think that technology... A really great story I want to tell you, though.
It's a broad church.
Yeah.
What I'm watching is young people being able to see things that I couldn't see when I was young. So when I was 30, I couldn't see the world in the same way. I just didn't have access to everything that's going on.
Yeah.
I couldn't listen to you or anybody on Instagram talk, do podcasts, do blah. Listen to really, really intelligent people engage with this kind of thing. And I'm watching young people now, they're just... Yeah.
I think that there is certainly something about that that's much democratic. But one of my favorite stories is that when, during the 2011 uprising in Egypt, Sisi, they were actually monitoring all the channels on internet, and so the activists actually organized some of the biggest demonstrations by using the landline because the landline could not be monitored. Who has a landline now? So I don't think it's technology, although I do think it does take some power out of the hands of the Guardian or the Telegraph or the Times when you can see the news anywhere. But there also needs to come with it a kind of a technological literacy that will allow the younger people to understand what it is that they're seeing. And they are becoming, as they become more sophisticated the more that they work with it. But there's also a lot of... I don't know, I don't like to say conspiratorial, but a lot of conspiratorial thinking there rather than systemic thinking there. And although I do believe, as an Iranian, I believe that just because you think they're, what is the famous thing? Just because you think they're after you, that doesn't mean that they're not. Yeah, just because you think it's a conspiracy that they're after you doesn't mean that they're not. I think that there is a certain degree of conspiratorial thinking going on, but there's also a lot of systemic stuff. And so I think that if technology is harnessed in such a way that can allow for people to sort of evade controlled channels, but also for people to have the technological literacy to be able to read and see what they want to and understand what is reliable and what is not, then it could be a force for good.
I'll just say three quick things because I think you made a very important point. The first is a lot of hope in the younger generation because they get it, because they are experiencing it. The horror of inequality where they can't afford housing, where the jobs they're getting are very uncertain, which may be taken over by AI. And of course, the climate catastrophe is in their faces. So I think, the skepticism of the current system is much, much greater in that generation. When I first started talking about anarchism in 2012, people would just laugh at you, and now this idea of a bottom-up revolution is much more plausible. The second thing is that the social media space has, to a significant degree, been dominated by the right, by the Andrew Tates, by Nigel Farage, people like that, and I think the left have really got to get with the program. And with that, I encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. But the third thing I'd say is rather different, which is I do passionately feel that we do best, we create something when we meet face to face, as we are now. And that something is lost on electronic media. And that something is what makes us most human. I can't even put words to it. And I passionately feel that unless we recreate that sense of the connection of the human, we are lost. Because, of course, our capitalism is a crisis of meaning and of spirit and the loss of our humanity, as well as it is injustice and inequality. So I do actually feel that the democratic revolution, the bottom-up revolution, will only come from us meeting in person and realizing our collective power and at last seeing each other, because most of us feel not seen. And this is why the right is successful, because they say, I fucking see you. I see you. I speak your language. When in fact, are not being seen as a much more individual phenomenon. And we see each other. And I think, somehow to generate from that a political change is our challenge.
So my question's to either of you, but undeniably we see multi-million corporations that are funding politicians, funding governments, funding wars, supporting wars for their own benefit. How do we take our power back as people from these corporations when they're not even accountable, like governments are?
A really good question, and in part because I think consumer activism just goes so far. You could try to sort of. Okay, so consumer activism goes so far, but on the other hand, mass boycotts are incredibly effective, and mass organization for such things as, for example, divestment campaigns are incredibly important. I do think that these are the kinds of actions that can be collective. So individual consumer action is meaningless, but if we do it collectively under the banner of boycott or divestment, I think it could have a bigger effect. The other thing that is happening, and has happened increasingly in the last 20 to 30 years, is the increase in the role of the corporation as a legal person, both here and in the United States and elsewhere, I think, actually, in the capitalist world, and the diminution of the citizen or of the member of the polity as a political actor. And I'm not entirely sure how that can be addressed. I think unless there is, again, a complete and utter bottom-up change that totally and completely dismantles capitalism.
I think there's a couple of things. I think protest has its place, but only in a very limited way. Say, over Israel-Palestine, the BDS movement is something I completely support. But in changing our own domestic circumstances, I worry that protest is nothing like enough, and in some strange way actually reaffirms the status quo, because we are protesting to them and asking them to change, rather than asserting our own agency. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the change is absolutely available to us by asserting that agency in organizing ourselves locally to take charge of our own circumstances. It can be where the next bike path is to the future of our local hospital. Patients, doctors, hospital porters, nurses can gather together to talk about the future of their hospital or their school. And in that way, we begin to generate locations of agency and power, which can eventually agglomerate to cover the whole. It doesn't have to be some holistic theory of changing the whole lot at once, which is, I think, our archetype of revolution, which is very outdated and very problematic because it actually leads to further oppression. The same thing in the workplace. I, of course, support cooperatives, but there isn't time to establish an ecology of cooperatives. We have to take over. And in that way, I believe in anarcho-syndicalism, which is the union, perhaps not, though, our current unions, but the power of workers working together to take over their own workplace. As, for instance, there was a movement that did that in Argentina, where workers literally took over their own factories. And I think that is a plausible technique, but it takes one to stand up and start it, and then I think it will spread. Maybe I'm wrong, this is hypothesis, but I don't see any better way of doing it.
We can all start it. So that I don't think we have time for any more questions. So
just one point. Just one.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry. Oh. Thank you for indulging me. I'm a trade unionist, activist, and a socialist. So I agree with a lot of what you're saying about the sort of society we need. But I don't think it's not mutually exclusive to fight for democratic reforms today and to protest and to fight for a different society. So on what we can do now, One of the things a lot of us trade unionists are doing is saying to the trade union leaders, particularly those who have members in the arms industry, is that they should be organising discussion with those workers to stop the arms industry, stop the arms going to Israel. We also say that, yes, the protests have been marvellous, they've been huge in many countries, but they haven't stopped the genocide. We need political strikes. We need to have strikes and action at the core. And this was the case during the Iraq war and the lead up to that. 1 million people on the streets didn't stop that war because of the interest of imperialism was so essential. They're prepared to override that. So I think we can take decisive action like that, and we need to mobilise together concretely. And just my question is, I mean, I think we're in a very different situation now from the post-Cold War period. That was a unipolar world where American imperialism could largely do what it liked, without any real serious threat. We now have the rise of China. We have the rise of Russia and other countries. I think the barbarism we're seeing in Gaza is a symptom of a new world situation, which is extremely fractured, extremely volatile and very dangerous. And the sort of period we had in the last 20 or 30 years is an aberration. We're now back to something like the 1930s or the interwar period of a lot of rising powers, declining powers. When Britain became a declining power, it became a very dangerous power lashing out. And I think that's the situation we're in. So unfortunately, unless we do build structures, unless we get involved in new left alternatives, socialist alternatives and so on, we are going to have more Gazas. Because this is a testing ground, I think. Just like where I'm from, Northern Ireland was a testing ground. Balfour, after all, said, let's create a little Ulster in the middle of the Middle East. So they've been here before and they'll do it again. And I think we have to mobilise, we have to be optimistic, we have to fight for rights today and use those democratic rights, defend what we've got, defend the right to protest, but under no illusions. To me, there's no progressive capitalism or imperialism. They are what they are. That's the nature of the beast, and we have to change that. And that's a huge task, but it's the only thing we can do.
Yeah. And in response, I have to say also that a lot of the people that are involved in movements like Palestine Action are actually, or were, because that's a proscribed organization now, are actually shifting ground to doing that kind of thing where they're trying to win over union members who are working in, GMB members who are, for example, working in arms factories. That hasn't been as successful actually as the work at the ports. And ports actually not just here, but also, well, actually not really here, but really not here at all, but in Europe actually. And I think that is really exciting stuff. So a combination of community organizing alongside port organizing, alongside union organizing, it could be really the way to go for the immediate moment.
I agree with, I think, everything you said. My only, it's not really a concern, but my only point I would make in response is I do worry that a theory of change is not very clear in people's heads. When I talk to those young people who are in despair about their future, they don't know what it is that can be done. This is why they're turning to the right, because there is a kind of horrible clarity about what they're offering. And I do think, we need to work a lot harder on creating a plausible theory of change to change the whole system, because lots and lots of people see that the whole system is the problem. We won't change it by electing Jeremy Corbyn, for instance. That won't be enough, and it won't happen fast enough. There has to be something much more fundamental, and I would love to see not necessarily a focus on one theory of change, because heterogeneity and eclecticism is very much part of the anarchist vision, that none of us know the answer, that we are in a way each capable of building our utopia, but we have to envision that and say that it's possible. We have to talk about how that it necessarily happens. I do feel sad when I hear people talking about PR or getting another 4 Green MPs in Parliament, or a Parliament, or reforming the House of Lords. There's nothing like enough.
What, to the end? No, I think we should discuss, because the thing is, right, we've heard a lot from the experts now, and they've been saying we have to do this ourselves, right? So a lot of us here we're all activists, I think, every single one of us. So let's talk about actions that we can do and new ways of organising. Yeah.